Welcome to another edition of Talking Together. I'm Richard Sentner. With me today are Ed Mangiafico and Lee Roscoe. I want to thank you both for being here. Today we're going to be discussing the war on civil liberties and whistleblowers. Before we get started, I want to kind of put this in a little bit of a context because we're going to be saying some pretty harsh things about what's taking place in these domains. But the truth is that in the context of other capitalist societies, the U.S. has a very good record when it comes to free speech issues, much better than most capitalist societies. And I just want to run through some of the stuff just to give you the idea of what I'm talking about. In the early 90s, a man by the name of Viktor Ostrovsky, who had been a member of the Mossad, which is the Israeli CIA, he retired and he moved to Canada and he wrote his memoirs, and the day before his memoirs were going to be published, Mossad went into Canadian court and they managed to get the publication stopped and said, you can't publish this book. So Ostrovsky came to the United States and he got a publisher here, St. Martin's Press. And again, the day before it was supposed to be published, Mossad went into American court and they got a judge to sign a stay, but only until the full court could meet. And when the full court met, they just threw the case out of court. They said, we can't stop this from being published, you know? So that's a difference, say, between Canada and the United States. In England, I'm sure everybody remembers the Salman Rushdie affair where a fatwa was put on his head by the Ayatollah Khomeini. At the same time, a group of Muslims in London sued Rushdie in London court and charged him with blaspheming the Muslim religion. And it went through the British court system all the way up to their equivalent of our Supreme Court. And the court ruled against the Muslim clerics, but on very interesting grounds. On the grounds that the Muslim religion is not the official religion of England, but that if he had written that about the Church of England, then he would have been guilty of blasphemy. You know, that's England. In France, you had Robert Forazon, who was a professor of literature at the Sorbonne, and he had written some essays questioning whether the death camps actually existed in the Second World War. And the first thing that happened was the Sorbonne fired him, and they defended it by saying, "Well, we can't defend him from all the people who will come after him, so we have to fire him." And then the government of France comes along and they arrest him and they charge him with falsification of history. So that's France. And then in both Austria and Germany, it's illegal to publicly advocate the position that the Holocaust never happened. And there was a man by the name of David Gordon in Austria who actually went to prison for 10 years because he gave a speech in which he questioned whether the gas chambers actually existed or not. So these are just kind of the examples of stuff that you would see in some other capitalist countries that you won't see here. And I should also add that I might bring Harry Calvin into this conversation, because Harry Calvin was the dean of First Amendment scholars, and he wrote a book summing up his whole career, his whole sort of scholarship career. It was called A Worthy Tradition. The only thing that's probably wrong with it is the title, because the whole free speech history isn't particularly worthy. But what Harry Calvin argued in the book was that you have a free society to the extent that you've gotten rid of the concept of seditious libel. Seditious libel is the concept that it's a crime to attack the state with words. And you know, John Adams was mainly responsible for the first major laws in this respect, the Alien and Sedition laws. And Woodrow Wilson, you know, the great Democrat Woodrow Wilson, sent a presidential candidate, Eugene Debs, to prison for 10 years because he gave an anti-war speech in the middle of the First World War. And Debs said, you know, as long as you have that on the books, you don't have a free society. By that standard, the U.S. became a free society in the 1960s when we finally got rid of it. So that's just sort of the context of free speech for us. And I wanted to put that out there before we get started on this, because I think we're going to be some sort of harsh things that we're going to be saying about this. So why don't you start us off, Ed?
Okay, and I'll pick up right where you are and say that while we did get rid of the Alien Sedition Act, we now are coming back on many of the things that were implied by that. I'd like to take a broader view of the whole issue of civil liberties in free speech as a part of that. Free speech manifests itself in what's happened to the idea of whistleblowers in the country. American civil liberties, first of all, I think are never more endangered than when we're promised greater national security.
Yeah.
Because if we're promised security, we'll trade anytime civil liberties for security.
Yeah.
And so we create, now we'll go back to something we talked about a few weeks ago. If we create fear, then that fear obviously engenders the need for security. And security breeds, in turn, because of greed, tremendous corruption. And I think that as we talk about civil liberties, I'd like to talk about it in the context of a very broad context. Free speech being a part of it, the treatment of whistleblowers certainly being a part of it, but also the war on education being a part of it. As one said, if you think education is expensive, try ignorance. Yeah. And I think that it's also true that we have so many issues, the idea of voter suppression. I mean, I think there's no more loss of civil liberty than the example of the interstate cross-check, which disenfranchised somewhere up to 7.4 million voters in this last election. Mm-hmm. And that kind of voter suppression is a loss of civil liberties, the ability to vote.
Sure.
The loss of the inability of people to, and of course, nothing is more important to understand than secrecy provides for the greatest amount of corruption. And that, therefore, we have the NSA domestic spying was able to get much further than we ever thought until we had some whistleblowers because of the, and incidentally, the treatment of the whistleblowers is sort of like the Alien Sedition Act, if you really think about it.
Yeah, sure.
Which they're thinking of calling back into function, by the way.
Yeah.
So
and which Abe Lincoln also, he had one as well.
So anyway,
a version of it.
Just in summary, I think it's important that we think of civil liberty loss in a very broad way, and also that we recognize that it benefits power, political power, and now that we truly have a plutocracy and it controls the political system, then it ensures that the power will remain where it is. Bill Moyers, I think a great quote from Bill Moyers I'll close with, he said, "Rarely have so few imposed such damage on so many, moving America closer to outright plutocracy. When political power is derived from wealth, it's devoted to the protection of wealth." And I think that that to me is takes us to a point that's made very well by Naomi Klein in her new book, in which it's important to recognize that the minute we get into secrecy, the minute we get into security trading off for civil liberties, we got to recognize that that benefits not only power, but it is consistent with deregulated capitalism that protects the wealth of plutocracy.
Can I have a turn here, or yeah. I'm just going to go to sleep after a while. I agree with you, and I went to something called Democracy School, which CELDEF gave recently, and what they talked about is what we all know, that established power always coalesces to the top and bends the laws, the regulatory agencies, the support systems, the police, military, community unto itself for its own ends in any society. I also agree with you, Ed, that we should look at this in a broader context. I was under the impression, in fact, that today was going to be a discussion of loss of our rights in general. And I didn't realize it was just whistleblowers and free speech, but I think we have a really, really large, well, the title was, I think we have a really large context to look at in terms of what our rights are. And I think a lot of Americans don't even understand what they are, what they were purported to be, set out to be, and protected by law to be. I think we need to look at how these rights are violated, by whom, because there are a number of different contexts in which they're violated, and how we restore them. So that's the content that I brought with me today. And of course, free speech is a huge part of that, and secrecy enabling a security state to write over the rights of free speech, as Glenn Greenwald has discussed really well in his book, No Place to Hide, which you have on the table, is a big part of it. But I also wanted to say that on the Cape, we have a history of defending rights since before the Revolution with James Otis Jr. It's interesting to think that right here in West Barnstable, the Patriot, as he was called, James Otis Jr., defended the incipient, not yet nation against the writs of assistance, which were a version of the NSA and the surveillance state that was happening because the English were coming into people's homes without warrants, trying to find smuggled goods, smuggled material. It was on that pretext. It was really to suppress the rising populace. And if it were not for James Otis, according to John Adams and others, there would have been no Fourth Amendment, which is critical to this discussion that we're having. And I'd like to read the Fourth Amendment, and I'd also later on in the show like to talk about the protection of rights, the struggle for that from the United States, from the Magna Carta to the United States to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and how some of those precepts are being violated specifically right now by the United States. So the Fourth Amendment. The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue but upon probable cause supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. And this impinges upon almost everything we might discuss today. It's Guantanamo, it's
this is a freedom that's actually been lost. I mean,
exactly.
The show that we did a couple of shows on Radley Balco's book about the rise of the police state. You know, the militarization of the police, the militarization of the police in this country. And he just documents in that book. It's an amazing documentation on how all these rights have been just whittled away. You know, so that there really isn't any protection in your home against the police invading you and coming in under the smallest pretext in the world, you know.
And
so that what you're talking about is that right, maybe more than any other right, has been completely lost. It really doesn't exist anymore.
It's been lost with the surveillance state, with the NSA, with the invasive technologies that can view our whole lives. It's been lost with, in some states, with police forfeiture, where if you are suspected of a crime, they can take virtually anything you've got in your vehicle. I'm not sure of this, so don't quote me, but they can stop you, and this happens particularly with immigrants. They can take what you've got, and it's forfeit, and it's almost impossible to prove your innocence to get it back.
Basic principle that Balco talks about is what they call the castle principle, which is that your home is your castle.
That's James Otis. He is the one who said a man's home is his castle.
And that's what's really been lost, is that your home is not your castle anymore. You know, and every time we have a new president, we have new laws that get passed in Congress to give the police even more and more powers to come into your home under the smallest pretext in the world. That's what he was talking about. And, you know, I got an email from John Amir. I don't know if you got this too, Ed, but he was saying that he was just amazed with all this talk about the militarization of the police and and how they're usurping
never
their
saw that
power
on
and everything else.
TV.
Why Balco's name is not even mentioned.
That's right.
You know, they're not even talking about this guy, and he's the guy that really blew the whistle on all of this.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a truly amazing book that this man wrote that takes you through all of it. It takes you how all the different laws have been whittled away, and all the principles have been whittled away, and the financing of it from the federal government.
And the examples.
It's an amazing thing, and yes, this guy is not even mentioned in any.
Not only is he not mentioned, but the book has been not given any coverage on the media.
And I don't think it's just the government. When we talk about who has usurped our rights, it's the corporations, it's the corporate state. They can view you when you are at work. They can demand that you don't smoke. They can demand drug tests. And that's just a small part of it. So there's the corporate state that violates our civil rights. There's the government, which violates our civil rights and is also in violation of international law. And I was thinking, it's too bad we don't have a friend of mine who is an international lawyer on this show. His specific interest is in how this government is violating people's civil rights abroad and under which laws. And it is also violation of our civil rights by individuals, by the enforcers for the corporate and government, the corporate state, the corporatocracy, those enforcers who may be the bad soldiers and military. And there's a whole list of violations of our rights, whether it's Guantanamo, undeclared war, whether it's the violation of the rights of the environment, whether it's the violation of human rights, such as we just saw at Ferguson. And you can attach them, and I'll let you all jump back in, but I'd like to attach some of these to the specific constitutional amendments which prohibit them later on in the show, because I have them in front of me.
Okay, Ed?
I would add to the list that we're giving there. I think the last few days we've been watching the reaction to the conditions in Ferguson and New York and Cleveland and so forth. And I think that there is an issue that we need to address as a part of this too. I don't question that there's corporate control. I like to say the corporate tail is wagging the political dog.
Yeah.
But so it's all about a political agenda, corporate agenda. But I think that it's important to understand the role of poverty and economic inequality.
Absolutely.
And I think that's the underlying issue to all of the other kinds of problems. And yet, that's an issue, the solutions to that issue are incompatible with unregulated capitalism as we have it in the United States. And for that reason, we have to face the reality that unless we change that which is so endemic into our value system, the neoliberal economic policies, we're really not going to be able to solve the problems because they fly in the face. As is true of climate change and other things, it's going to fly in the face of capitalist interest. And so therefore, unless we address that issue and the issue of economic inequality and poverty, I think we're not going to really address the issues of civil liberties.
And we're talking about a national security state is what we're talking about. I mean, and that's what the NSA is all about.
Well, that's what all of it is about.
The whole 800,000 people that Dana Priest documented for the Washington Post who work for the security state is part of it. And part of the problem is education. I don't think that kids understand. I don't think half the Americans understand what rights are. What are they? Okay, what is a right? And here are some of the rights that were defined in the 18th century. Congress shall make no law respect. This is Amendment number 1 of the Bill of Rights. The first 10 amendments of the Bill of Rights are part of the Constitution.
That's what they call the Bill of Rights.
That's right, exactly. And then there were amendments that were added, and they are all to protect, not all of them, but many of them are to protect our rights. So the First Amendment was, there shall be no abridging of the freedom of speech. Whistleblowers, Greenwald, Snowden, which we'll talk about, Binney, Thomas Drake, the people who have been persecuted for speaking. That's a violation of the First Amendment. The Fourth Amendment, the right of the people, which I read. The Sixth Amendment, which pertains to Guantanamo detainees, to immigrants who are detained in prisons because they're treated as stateless human beings without the rights of citizens. The Sixth Amendment, in all criminal prosecutions, the accused shall enjoy the right to a speedy and public trial by an impartial jury. Is that happening? No. The Eighth Amendment, excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted. That's been violated. We can all give examples of how that's been violated. We go to the 11th Amendment, and that's a tricky one, but it will make states immune from suits of out-of-state citizens and foreigners not living within our state borders. Well, you look at NAFTA and TPP and GATT and the type of trade agreements that are happening right now, and they are in violation of the 11th Amendment, of those rights. You look at the 13th Amendment, which abolishes slavery and involuntary servitude except as punishment for a crime, and I think that's weird, but and you look at human trafficking, which is going on, which has nothing to do with the government. It has everything to do with profit, and that's in violation of people's rights not to be slaves, not to be enslaved.
Okay, we're talking about the rights. Why don't we talk about some of the specific things with regard to whistleblowers and, and the government itself, particularly about this particular government. Ed, do you want to give us a spiel on that?
Yeah, and I think it's a good segue into James Risen's book that I'd like to comment on and to recommend to everybody. I don't know if you can focus in on that. Does it focus? Yeah. It's Pay Any Price. The subtitle is Greed, Power, and Endless War, which, of course, is fundamentally about how we suppress everything that it gets in the way of that.
Yeah.
And he talks about a number of the whistleblowers who have tried and been people who are now either dead or in prison or living miserable lives that were caught in the process of trying to let people know what was going on. It's an excellent book. It's a scary book, of course, because you'll become aware of what really is going on. And I think that in that book he covers some very interesting people who have committed themselves, who didn't get the popularity of a Snowden or WikiLeaks or some of the others, but that have done yeoman's work in saying this is the right thing to do in the face of the rights that we have. I think it's also true, though, to say that I'm going to be a little different on this. We have so departed from what we quote the founding fathers did. The fact of the matter is, even the Supreme Court of the United States, whose job it is to interpret the Constitution, has interpreted it in very funny ways in its current configuration. And so, I don't know, I find that we need to talk about the reality of where we are, not where we ought to be. We all know where we ought to be, but where we ought to be isn't going to be anymore. That I think is something that is important to understand, because it is inconsistent with the neoliberal macroeconomic values that we have become a part of our DNA. And as long as that is true, then it doesn't matter what all those fancy things are that we're supposed to believe in. We don't do any of them. I mean, let's talk about torture. The torture program is a great example. And yet we accept torture now. Think of all the people got all excited about the Patriot Act when it first came out.
Well, this is a point that you're raising, which is, I think, very critical here, is that when the Bush administration instituted a lot of these, what I would call crimes, sort of legal crimes, it was thought, it was kind of interpreted as emergency measures, you know, and people, I don't think, were taking them all that seriously because they were looked upon as being so extreme. But now Obama comes along and he doubles down on them, and so it's no longer emergency. Now it's become
normative.
Very normative, very normative, and that's the real crime, and that's the argument that I forget the man's name who used to run the Center for Constitutional Rights.
Yeah, Michael Ratner.
Michael Ratner. He was the guy who was saying this, that he was warning about this.
That's right.
You know, saying that if we allow this to go uncorrected, then it will just become part of our history, and it will be too late to roll them back.
And think about it for just a minute. Let's talk about why that is the case. Why is that the case? Because the minute we created what we called the war on terror, which is a war on anything we want it to be about, the minute we created this thing called the war on terror, we really created the ability for people to make money and attain power on a war that we knew would never end.
Absolutely.
And we got the control through secrecy and control of insecurity and breeding fear that allowed us to do whatever we wanted to. Go to James Risen for a minute in chapter 1.
It's an amazing story that he tells about the money in Iraq. What happened to all these billion, they're now saying it's between 1.2 and 1.6 billion dollars. And they know where it is.
They do know where it is, because I remember years ago they reported that there was X billions that just were in suitcases that disappeared.
Pallets on pallets.
Yeah.
They know where it is, but no one's going after it. No one will go after it. The Iraqi government will go after it. The U.S. government will go after it.
And
they opened up the vault at the New York Fed and said, ship them. And we wanted it in small denominations. And they said, oh, the smallest denomination we can ship is $100 bills. So they had pallets of $100 bills. They shipped over $20 billion.
That's right.
Incidentally, to your point earlier about what this breeds in terms of the very fact that the Homeland Security, quote unquote, which is the thing about which is a manifestation of the war on terror, now is approaching $500 billion a year in all of its costs. $500 billion a year, which could solve all kinds of domestic problems.
I'd like to jump in here and say that just about a week ago, and I'm just going to read this from a PBS report, the United Nations criticized the United States over rights issues, over issues of torture, police malpractice, and immigrant detention. After reviewing the recent use of the history of torture in the United States, the United Nations Committee Against Torture, which is part of the Convention Against Torture, I believe, I mean, there are laws, and I can read a letter from an international lawyer as regards that, expressed concern that the United States has not gone far enough in the absolute prohibition of torture and ill treatment of detainees held both domestically and abroad within detention centers at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, and Bagram, Afghanistan. And that's the ones we know about. The committee chastised the use of indefinite detention without charge or trial, as well as prolonged mental harm on detainees because it's more difficult to monitor and measure than physical abuse. And undermines international agreements and standards about how nations are supposed to hold prisoners, particularly the Nuremberg principles and the Geneva Conventions. And I'm not a lawyer, but there's a whole host of prohibitions in international law against what we're doing to violate people's civil rights at home and abroad. Furthermore, the committee demanded more transparency over the Central Intelligence Agency's use of extraordinary rendition, secret detainment, and enhanced interrogation techniques between 2001 and 2008 that involved numerous human rights violations, including ill treatment and enforced disappearance of persons suspected and involved. I mean, this makes me want to tear my hair out. This is what Banana Republics did. This is what Pinochet did. This is monstrous that my country should be involved in these murderous violations of civil rights. And the report goes on to say that the UN also called into question the expanded use of prison-like detention facilities, county jails, and private prisons for undocumented immigrants. This is happening right here in Plymouth County. The Social Justice Committee of the Unitarian Church in Brewster has been working on this, and I got an ACLU document that stated abuses going on in the Plymouth Detention Center of immigrants that are heinous, are complete violations of their freedom, their rights.
Going on all over the country.
And going on all over the country. And in the U.S. prison system, the committee said, and I'm skipping here because it would take all week to read this, it was seriously concerned over incidents of sexual violence among inmates and prison staff, police brutality and the use of tasers. The ACLU echoed the United Nations condemnation of torture. The Obama administration needs to match its rhetoric with actions by supporting full accountability for torture. That's just a piece of it. And they're suppressing the torture document. Why doesn't Udall, pardon my frenzy here, but I mean, why doesn't Udall just do what the guy did for Ellsberg and read it into the congressional record? He'd be immune for prosecution. We'd know what went on, and we could take people to task. I mean,
we don't want to do that.
Of course I don't want to do that.
It's horrifying. Excuse me, I'm squeaking. I mean, here's a letter to the editor of the New York Times from Michael Hager, international lawyer. In reviewing the United States compliance with the Convention Against Torture, United Nations monitoring panel recently cited, among other American lapses, failure of the Obama administration to investigate and hold parties accountable for past instances of torture. Such a lack of accountability is more than a treaty breach. It signals a dangerous permissiveness toward torture and cruelty practices in the future.
I think that one of the things, and of course we've got to recognize that, look, America hasn't lived by those principles, except for, the reality is that we were very fortunate in living when we did in our era, because we lived in an aberration of American history, the period from World War II until 1980. And when there was much more of a sense of the common, a sense of communitarian interest and what have you.
At least inside the country, not so much outside the country.
Inside the country, inside the country, yeah. But I think that, there's another book that I have to refer to that I think is just priceless, that helps put us in perspective, called Nazis Next Door.
I just read it. It was fantastic.
And so Alan Dulles, who was head of the CIA while his brother Foster was Secretary of State, long story short, arranged to get the number of high-ranking Nazi officers, including Himmler's chief of staff, to come to the United States, be protected from Nuremberg, and help us fight communism. One of them just recently died in New Jersey, having lived a full life in the United States. We go back in history, there are examples after examples. I mean, look, the genocide of the Native Americans, the treatment of the
And the
Jim
truth
Crow.
is that the U.S.'s opposition to fascism had a very short period.
Oh.
I mean, from about 1941 to 1945.
That's right.
And the first operations of the CIA, when the Second World War was over, was to overthrow the resistance forces and put the fascist collaborators back into power all over continental Europe. And those were the first operations. That's where the French Connection came out of.
That's right.
We reconstituted the Corsican Mafia as a payoff to be goons, to break up the unions that were a major part of the resistance forces.
We also Mussolini had gotten rid of the mafia, in Sicily, and we got them all out of jail in Chicago and New York, put them on the fronts of the tanks. when we invaded Sicily.
You
and put him
mentioned
in
that
charge.
last time that Patton helped do that.
So I
Is that
think,
correct?
yeah, I think that.
As well as he was an insane anti-Semite, as it turned out in
and-
Whistleblowers' book.
Well, and don't
Yeah.
forget, people like Lindbergh,
Yeah.
Henry Ford were
Pro-Nazi.
Yeah, pro-Nazi.
And there was also, I mean, just to divert for a minute, there was also tremendous support for Nazism in the Ivy League. I read a very interesting book about that, very well documented.
Sure. It was, incidentally, fascism at one point, don't forget, was considered an ideal form of government if you wanted to create. So now, incidentally, recognizing Giantini's original concept of a merger of financial interests with the control of government, that's where we are.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, that's
not
that's a
necessarily.
different debate.
Yeah.
I mean, fascism has taken on a lot different context than just
Now.
corporations taking on.
We
I
have
mean,
given it that.
It's a lot more than that. It's.
That's why I said I just went back to Giantini's original concept, not what we.
I mean, if you take a look at the fascist regimes, we wouldn't be able to hold a TV show like this without the cops busting in.
Exactly. Thank God. I mean, you know, as much as we kvetch, at least there's still. That's, I think, we have to tell people. That's why we're so concerned. We don't want to see our country take that long leap off the board into the danger zone that other countries have taken.
I think you're being naive.
Too kind.
Yeah, I think you're being naive.
Yeah.
The reality is that.
No, why is she being naive?
Now, because you see, I think you're assuming, of course, that fascism means having a dictator and so forth. Like
it doesn't
No,
matter.
no,
I mean,
I'm not
you can use whatever term you want. You don't use the word fascism.
Totalitarianism
But the
can
point
be
she's talking about, I think, is very
plutocratic.
valid.
No.
It's very valid.
Well, let's think.
That
Let's
we're not
think
quite
about it.
there.
Let's think
We're
about
not
it a
quite
bit.
there yet. Well,
Let me.
Well, explain to me why the
Go
cops
ahead.
aren't breaking in and
Why aren't
No, the
arresting
cops
us.
aren't breaking in
Yet.
Dick. But let me tell you, they're doing something almost equivalent. They're controlling, the corporate agenda is controlling the Congress of the United States, the Supreme Court, and
can't
the
argue with that.
presidency,
Right.
and the executive branch. And that means that our voices really aren't heard very much.
it's a velvet glove.
Yes, we can-
which I said, and it can't happen here when I adapted
yeah.
the
You know,
play
to a
years
large
ago.
extent,
It's
that's a
velvet
failure.
glove.
That's a failure on our part, not a failure on the system's part. The fact that we haven't been able to break through, but the opportunities are there. The opportunities to organize are there. The opportunities to educate are there. It's there. It's not. The cops aren't going to stop us from doing this. The fact that we
cops
haven't.
aren't, but the cops aren't. But
the system is.
the
you're
system
saying?
is going to.
Selectively.
Well, I don't agree with that.
I'll come in the middle of both of you and say that selectively, back to the original theme, selectively, it has happened that the cops have busted down the doors. Will you take Binney?
They'll bust down the door if you happen to be a black organizer in Chicago or
Exactly.
something. You know.
Or if you're a
or
whistleblower.
Binney was
Look
a
what happened to
whistleblower.
Binney.
Yeah.
Binney, who conceived of Echelon, which was the preamble to the NSA, PRISM, and all the other programs that you know, Thin Thread.
Thin Thread is what he said.
Thin Thread. He was one of the people who conceived of total surveillance, but only if justified by law. You know, so-and-so, the conventional thing, if so-and-so has committed a crime, we get a warrant, we take a look. His system was enabling this to happen more swiftly. And when he found that it was being turned on American citizens, he tried to blow the whistle, and he was tromped on, and the FBI came in. He was in the shower. He's talked about it on TV. He was nude. His family was terrorized. Similar things happened to Thomas
in
Drake.
Risen's
I'm
book,
sure
yeah.
it's in Risen's book. So there have been selected whistleblowers. And look what happened, not by our police, but David Miranda, Glenn Greenwald's partner, being stopped by GCHQ. So there are incidents of that. Laura Poitras constantly she's the one who did Citizen 4, which I haven't seen yet, but we all should see because this is about another brave whistleblower who is apparently remaining anonymous in concert with Snowden to reveal all of these, all of the surveillance state. She has been stopped at the border every time she tries to pass. That's why she's living in Berlin. Yeah. So while they're not coming in and crashing down our doors, we're on that dangerous slippery slope.
Yeah, it is a slippery slope. Yeah.
And it is. And you know, I see these demonstrations we've been watching the last few nights, and there was a time when that much demonstration would have meant much more, because
True.
It is now believed that they can control that, and that people, and part of it is that the control of the media, part of it is the control of the political structure, the court system. I mean, the racial class bias in our court system is unbelievable.
It's
Incidentally,
it's insane.
there's another book that I'd like to recommend on this subject, and this is Bob Herbert. Many will remember Bob Herbert as a columnist for the New York Times, and it's called "Losing Our Way: An Intimate Portrait of Troubled America." And he does a magnificent job of explaining in each category what really has happened to us and is happening, without a great deal of optimism.
In each category of what, Ed?
Well, in each category of meaning, in terms of the effect of poverty, the effect of the prison system, the effect on education, the effect on the military, the use of perpetual war. Each of these categories we've just been talking about are covered with examples of people's lives within that. And it's a fascinating book. He's a good writer. I've always liked his columns when he was at the Times. And he, I think, shows how much there is. And you know, if you put that in context with the numbers in the other book, and you say Homeland Security costing $500 billion a year,
yeah.
The amount of money on pallets that are wasted going to Iraq.
The prison system.
The money goes to the private prison system.
Yeah.
All of these things, and then you see the effect of poverty. Yeah. And the hopelessness that it engenders.
Right. Then
you know that the solution has to be a very basic restructuring of our system.
Oh, definitely.
And that is not something that the power structure wants to see happen.
Well, we're working on it. There are things starting to happen.
And Glenn Greenwald, in his book, believes that Snowden's, his revelations and also how public it's become, we even surprised Greenwald, and it's having a very positive effect. And I want to actually read what he says about that, because I think it's very important.
You ought to show people that book too.
It's a great
yes,
book.
it's called No Place to Hide. Glenn
book.
Greenwald, who's the man that Snowden has been releasing these documents to, here's what he says. He says, the Obama administration, which has brought more prosecutions against leakers than all prior presidencies combined, has sought to create a climate of fear that would stifle any attempts at whistleblowing. But Snowden has destroyed the template. He has managed to remain free outside of the grasp of the United States. What's more, he has refused to remain in hiding, but proudly came forward and identified himself. As a result, the public image of him is not a convict in orange jumpsuit and shackles, but an independent, articulate figure who can speak for himself, explaining what he did and why. It is no longer possible for the U.S. government to distract from the message simply by demonizing the messenger. There's a powerful lesson here for future whistleblowers. Speaking the truth does not have to destroy your life. And for the rest of us, Snowden's inspirational effect is no less profound. Quite simply, he has reminded everyone about the extraordinary ability of any human being to change the world. An ordinary person, in all outward respects, raised by parents without particular wealth or power, lacking even a high school diploma, working as an obscure employee of a giant corporation, he has, through a single act of conscience, literally altered the course of history. Even the most committed activists are often tempted to succumb to defeatism. The prevailing institutions seem too powerful to challenge. Orthodoxies feel too entrenched to uproot. There are always many parties with vested interest in maintaining the status quo, but it is human beings collectively, not a small number of elites working in secret, who can decide what kind of world we want to live in. Promoting the human capacity to reason and make decisions. That is the purpose of whistleblowing, of activism, of political journalism. And that's what is happening now, thanks to the revelations brought by Edward Snowden.
That's a great statement.
Yeah.
And he
it's
does a good
beautiful
job
at
in
the
that
end of
whole
the
book.
He does.
It's a wonderful book. I think Greenwald, as well as Snowden, is to
The
be
hero,
really commended.
absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
He, Poitras, and The Guardian, and those who broke the story,
Yeah.
and who had enough savvy to do. And they all live out of the country, though. Note, he won't. He's in Brazil.
Yeah,
There's things going on at the grassroots level about rights specifically. I've been involved in a group that we're kind of stalled right now, but we'll go back to it. We're trying to create a community bill of rights. And we were inspired by CELDEF, and that is, the acronym stands for, I always forget, Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund. And they have done some first in the nation legal action at the community level, which is outstanding. And for instance, they have got an ecosystem to defend its own rights in court, and that happened in Pennsylvania. This has to do with fracking, so that the community, they've got a community rights state constitutional amendment in Colorado. They've got another banning of fracking attached to a community bill of rights. And they're working on an international rights of nature. And locally, we came up with a community bill of rights that we might actually be able to enact at the county level, because the laws of Massachusetts in fact support that, because we have a county commission. So Barnstable County, unlike other places in Massachusetts, might actually have a shot at getting this enacted, and it would take away some of that power from the state and federal regulatory agencies and bring it back to us, so that we could do things like stop NSTAR from poisoning us, so that we can have more power in shutting down the nuke. And some of the things we're talking about are an environment, the rights of the environment, particularly, let me see, the right, Article 4, the right of interdependent natural communities. It's the right of the human community on behalf of the biosphere in which we live locally as well as globally, and upon which our health and well-being is dependent. I think the Earth agrees here, to control and limit the toxins, pollutants, fertilizers, and radiation that threaten us. We must provide an unpolluted, clean, non-toxic, and sustainable environment and economy for our contemporary community and for future generations of Barnstable County's special and fragile biosystems, oceans, bays, marshes, woodlands, surface waters, aquifers, and skies, as well as the plants, animals, and people which live within their webs. And we have things like the right to clean drinking water, the right to sustainable local food, the right to not have corporations lobby, the right perhaps even to change charter law down the line so that corporations could be subject to the same rules that governed them when this country was first formed, when the colony was first formed. They had to apply to the common good, and if they violated that, betrayed the common good in any way, their charters could be revoked. So there's a plethora of potential that's happening underneath this horrible wound. Dead silence.
No, I agree with that. I think there is great potential.
Yeah.
But there's great hazard too. That's the thing.
Yeah.
And you just wonder if
Courts have to rule.
Yes, courts have to rule.
you just wonder if people aren't
right.
kind of getting used to how bad things are, and they have a hard time envisioning that things could actually improve.
That's right.
And I think that's a problem. Is we have to find a way to sort of buoy people up.
That is the key point you just hit, Dick. You ought to put a big emphasis on that.
Yeah.
It becomes part of the DNA. It becomes a part of our cultural DNA, that we accept that this is what is normal. We've accepted torture now.
Right.
We've accepted things.
I just saw this through the war in Iraq, where so many friends of mine had just had their heads buried in the sand. You know, they just didn't want to know about it. They didn't want to hear about it. It was too horrific for them to contemplate. And I think in the back of their minds was the fact that there's really not much I can do, and it's just too much to even deal with. So I prefer to watch the Super Bowl or a soap opera or something else, you know.
They should read Atticus Lish's new book, Preparation for the Next Life. It's a novel, and it may be this generation's Michael Herr's Dispatches, if you remember that. It's an Iraqi war vet who comes back. Yeah. And even through the damage, he's trying to be decent, but he cannot go above that damage. And his world that he lives in is a world of the impoverished, and their violence, their anger. Yeah. There's a lot of violence in the book, be warned.
What's the name of the book?
It's Preparation for the Next Life by Atticus Lish. Yeah. And he falls in love with an immigrant who is half Han and half Uyghur. And the portrayal of her as prey, she's constantly having to evade homeland, immigration. They put her in jail for a few months. It's obviously based on reality, and she's able to get out, but she's constantly watching her back. And it's a real picture of what's happening to human rights and human dignity in this nation.
Well, I think we ought to stop and pick up on your point. If you think about those demonstrations we've been watching the last few weeks, and you realize that there is not only an anger, a frustration, but what's really there is a sense of hopelessness, a sense that there is no realistic expectation of achievement. Mm. Because remember, in Ferguson, where 50% of that community, black community, is unemployed. Right. Think of the people who are, you saw the young man, the fellow who was selling loose cigarettes. Right. 5 children, married for 27 years, trying to make a penny for his family. Right. There's a sense of hopelessness that brings on rage. That has to be channeled if we're going to make change. That has to do what happened in the 30s with the labor movement, and it can't happen piecemeal and without leadership.
A writer recently said that what happened in Ferguson is the end of the Obama administration, because the Obama administration was seen as the first post-racial
gave the lie to that, didn't
and
it?
this ended that completely.
Exactly.
And to me, it's just another example of an issue, race, that has been suppressed for a very, very long time now.
And class, race and class. We don't look at race and class in this country. We just don't look. Yeah. You know, I want to veer away for a minute back to rights, because I brought with me the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I have to say, anybody who's watching this, go to your computer, go to your library, and get this document. This is a profoundly important document that could save us all.
Eleanor Roosevelt.
Eleanor Roosevelt was majorly involved in creating this document.
Abide by it.
If we would abide by it, and if you read again some of the things that are suggested as human rights that are being violated. Article 5, again, I keep coming back to this, but no one shall be subjected to torture, to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. Article 6, everyone has the right to recognition everywhere as a person before the law. Doesn't that apply to 11 million quote-unquote illegal aliens? Give them amnesty. They're human beings. It's wrong. This is a huge country. Allow them to be here and be productive and happy. Don't oppress people. Article 7, all are equal before the law and are entitled without, makes me cry, without any discrimination to equal protection of the law.
When was this?
Yes, when was
adopted?
this
When
adopted?
was this adopted?
That's a good-
1947. I believe.
40s.
I think you're
Okay,
right,
so
yes, yeah.
all the years of Jim Crow, this thing was in existence, right?
Exactly.
I mean,
Exactly.
But it doesn't mean it's not valid. It doesn't mean it's something we can't aspire to.
No, I know.
Article
Of
12,
course.
no one shall be subjected to arbitrary interference with his privacy, family, home, or correspondence. Not to attack upon, nor to attacks upon his honor and reputation. Everyone has the right to protection. That's the surveillance state. That's Article 14. Everyone has the right to seek and enjoy in other countries asylum from persecution.
but we have a lot of documents, and our government decides what to obey and what not to obey.
That's right.
That's right.
That's what it comes
right.
down to.
That's right.
And whether and how to and what applies to those people we like and those people we don't like.
That's
Sure, it's this
right.
double standard that we have. There's one
right.
rule for us and a different rule for everyone else.
That's right.
That's right.
That's right. And incidentally, that's a. I made a note in reading a couple of books that I liked. A comment made: American exceptionalism leads to self-delusion that we have the answer, and that becomes a tremendous force for evil.
I would endorse that. I want to return to your original statement when you were talking about security, sort of giving up rights for security. I want to point out that it's a false sense of security we're talking about. It's not.
Absolutely.
It's not real
Right.
security, and not only that, but governments have never really been interested in security that much at all. And I wanted to say this one story, because Chomsky's written about this, is that at the end of the Second World War, the U.S. was in a position of global dominance that the world had never seen before. We had half the world's wealth. We controlled both oceans. We controlled both sides of both oceans. We had no enemies in sight. Our rivals were all basket cases. There's been nothing like it in history.
Right.
And there was one development that was kind of coming up over the horizon that could cause a real security problem for us, and that was the development of intercontinental ballistic missiles.
Okay.
The U.S. was the only country that had them. If you were really concerned about your security, you would want to negotiate treaties, to make sure that other countries didn't get them. And Chomsky went through the declassified record, and he could find nothing. There was no discussion about this at all. None.
Because it was too much of a moneymaker.
Which tells you how much they really
Yes.
care
Yeah.
about real security.
Look what we just did this week. This week,
Yeah.
the United Nations had the ban of weapons in outer space. Only 2 countries voted against it.
Yeah.
The United States and Israel.
And Israel.
Yeah,
sure.
that's right.
I think we're going to have to call it there.
Well,
Thank you very much. I appreciate both of you being here. Thank you. Until next time, do whatever you can for peace and social justice. Thank you very much. But only until the full court could meet. And when the full court met, they just threw the case out of court. They said, we can't stop this from being published, So that's a difference, say, between Canada and the United States. In England, I'm sure everybody remembers the Salman Rushdie affair, where a fatwa was put on his head by the Ayatollah Khomeini. At the same time, a group of Muslims in London sued Rushdie in London court and charged him with blaspheming the Muslim religion. And it went through the British court system all the way up to their equivalent of our Supreme Court. And the court ruled against the Muslim clerics, but on very interesting grounds. On the grounds that the Muslim religion is not the official religion of England, but that if he had written that about the Church of England, then he would have been guilty of blasphemy. You know, that's England. In France, you had Robert Forazon, who was a professor of literature at the Sorbonne, and he had written some essays questioning whether the death camps actually existed in the Second World War. And the first thing that happened was the Sorbonne fired him, and they defended it by saying, "Well, we can't defend him from all the people who will come after him, so we have to fire him." And then the government of France comes along and they arrest him and they charge him with falsification of history. So that's France. And then in both Austria and Germany, it's illegal to publicly advocate the position that the Holocaust never happened. And there was a man by the name of David Gordon in Austria who actually went to prison for 10 years because he gave a speech in which he questioned whether the gas chambers actually existed or not. So these are just kind of the examples of stuff that you would see in some other capitalist countries that you won't see here. And I should also add that I might bring Harry Calvin into this conversation, because Harry Calvin was the dean of First Amendment scholars, and he wrote a book summing up his whole career, his whole sort of scholarship career. It was called A Worthy Tradition. The only thing that's probably wrong with it is the title, because the whole free speech history isn't particularly worthy. But what Harry Calvin argued in the book was that you have a free society to the extent that you've gotten rid of the concept of seditious libel. Seditious libel is the concept that it's a crime to attack the state with words. And you know, John Adams was mainly responsible for the first major laws in this respect, the Alien and Sedition laws. And Woodrow Wilson, you know, the great Democrat Woodrow Wilson, sent a presidential candidate, Eugene Debs, to prison for 10 years because he gave an anti-war speech in the middle of the First World War. And Debs said, you know, as long as you have that on the books, you don't have a free society. By that standard, the U.S. became a free society in the 1960s when we finally got rid of it. So that's just sort of the context of free speech for us. And I wanted to put that out there before we get started on this, because I think we're going to be some sort of harsh things that are...
Education being a part of it. As one said, if you think education is expensive, try ignorance. Yeah. And I think that it's also true that we have so many issues, the idea of voter suppression. I mean, I think there's no more loss of civil liberty than the example of the interstate cross-check, which disenfranchised somewhere up to 7.4 million voters in this last election. Mm-hmm. And that kind of voter suppression is a loss of civil liberties, the ability to vote.
Sure.
The loss of the inability of people to, and of course, nothing is more important to understand than secrecy provides for the greatest amount of corruption. And that, therefore, we have the NSA domestic spying was able to get much further than we ever thought until we had some whistleblowers because of the, and incidentally, the treatment of the whistleblowers is sort of like the Alien Sedition Act, if you really think about it.
Yeah, sure.
Which they're thinking of calling back into function, by the way.
Yeah.
So
and which Abe Lincoln also, he had one as well.
So anyway,
a version of it.
Just in
we're going to be saying about this, so why don't you start us off, Ed?
Okay, and I'll pick up right where you are and say that while we did get rid of the Alien Sedition Act, we now are coming back on many of the things that were implied by that. I'd like to take a broader view of the whole issue of civil liberties in free speech as a part of that. Free speech manifests itself in what's happened to the idea of whistleblowers in the country. American civil liberties, first of all, I think are never more endangered than when we're promised greater national security.
Yeah.
Because if we're promised security, we'll trade anytime civil liberties for security.
Yeah.
And so we create, now we'll go back to something we talked about a few weeks ago. If we create fear,
Yeah.
then that fear obviously engenders the need for security. And security breeds, in turn, because of greed, tremendous corruption. And I think that as we talk about civil liberties, I'd like to talk about it in the context of a very broad context. Free speech being a part of it, the treatment of whistleblowers certainly being a part of it, but also the war in
Welcome to another edition of Talking Together. I'm Richard Sentner. With me today are Ed Mangiafico and Lee Roscoe. I want to thank you both for being here. Today we're going to be discussing the war on civil liberties and whistleblowers. Before we get started, I want to kind of put this in a little bit of a context because we're going to be saying some pretty harsh things about what's taking place in these domains. But the truth is that in the context of other capitalist societies, the U.S. has a very good record when it comes to free speech issues, much better than most capitalist societies. And I just would like to run through some of the stuff just to give you the idea of what I'm talking about. In the early 90s, a man by the name of Viktor Ostrovsky, who had been a member of the Mossad, which is the Israeli CIA, he retired and he moved to Canada and he wrote his memoirs, and the day before his memoirs were going to be published, Mossad went into Canadian court and they managed to get the publication stopped and said you can't publish this book. So Ostrovsky came to the United States and he got a publisher here, St. Martin's Press. And again, the day before it was supposed to be published, Mossad went into American court and they got a judge to sign a stay.